We have a few more minutes, but after you've got your coffee, if you'll swing over to my left and fill in the seats on that side, that's a gift to those who stroll in, and taking 9:15-ish as a suggestion. And And our folks who are tuning in online are tuning in, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to those of you who shimmied over to this way to leave some spots for folks who may be joining us when we're already in progress. I'm Catherine Bush, Associate Rector for Formation here at Calvary, and it is a delight to be gathered with y'all in our spaces that are such as they are every week. Something new to see, some new light switch that works or doesn't. You know, it's joyful and exciting, and we're pushing on to January. But really glad that we can be gathered in our great hall to make space for these good conversations, and especially to have Dr. Mitzi Miner back in our midst. She was here last Sunday. If you missed it, go back and look at it online. I'll tell you right now, I have actually quoted her to several people and had her quoted back to me by others, which doesn't happen all the time. I mean, I'm just saying, that's not necessarily how it always goes. And have been resting in this idea of which kingdom I might try to live more completely in. So thank you for that. If you don't know, Dr. Miner is the Mary Magdalene Professor of New Testament at Memphis Theological Seminary. I just like saying your full title because I like talking about Mary Magdalene whenever we can. It's the best named chair ever. And she's on sabbatical right now, so we're even more privileged that she is spending this precious, precious time with us. So I won't take any more of her time, and welcome back, Dr. Miner. Thanks.
So thanks for, again, the warm welcome I always receive here is a real gift to me, and thank you all for that, so very much. And it is good to see you. It is good to be in this space. I know you all must come in every Sunday and go, okay, what's new this week? And that's kind of cool. So a blessed All Saints Sunday to all of you. I lost 3 very dear friends this past year. And so today I am thinking of them in the great cloud of witness us on, who went before us and as I am very aware myself, taught me so that I could go also on this path and on this journey. And I'm very grateful for all of them, and you probably as well. I remember the first All Saints Sunday that I went to after my dad died. I didn't think I was going to get through the service. I adored my father and still do. And so, a blessed and holy day for all of you as we do this today. One quick comment about last Sunday when I was talking about Jesus just living as if he was a citizen of a different kingdom, that being a saint, since this is All Saints Sunday, really has to do with the one to whom we belong, and in this case, to belong to God and to belong to God's kingdom. And I made a comment that he didn't initiate conflict, and somebody afterwards said, well, what about when he went in the temple? And I actually meant to say, when I was doing my thing last week, one exception, and I forgot to say that. And that one, he pretty much initiated that one, for sure. So that's how we took a look at last week. Hey, Nathan. And Okay, by the way, I'm a little ticked at y'all about Nathan, but I'm going to get over it, okay? So there you go. That's right. You are, actually. So today, what we're going to do is take a look at some saints in the New Testament, but I'm going to guess some saints you do not know very much about. I'm a lover of mystery novels. I don't know what kind of reading you all may do when you get in bed at night or whatever. Got some mystery novel fans nodding their heads at me, and that happens to be mine. So the work we're going to do today requires a little detective work, and that always kind of gets my juices flowing. So so that'll be fun. I'm going to be looking at Romans 16 today, which is a very odd chapter in the New Testament, actually. So it's the very end of the letter to the Romans, and it's the chapter where Paul is saying, tell all these people I said hi, and greet them, and he lists them. And if you ever have somebody that you just need to get back at just a little bit, figure out a way to assign them to read Romans 16 publicly and have to say all of those names. Although, I'll say that. So Carla Meisterman, who is the pastor at Balmoral PCUSA Church, and an MTS grad and worked with us for a while, she actually had to read it in chapel one time and did not stumble. And when she finished, we gave her a standing ovation. So because of that, Romans 16 is just often thought of, people look at this and go, oh, that's like this long list of names where Paul says, greet these people, and then they're like, it's kind of like the begat chapters, you think that's not interesting. Okay, wrong. So let me tell you why this is interesting, because in the midst of these names, what we find are some people who are really intriguing and who have some things to teach us about what it means to be saints. So you got to do a little detective work, so that's what we're going to do today. Here's how the chapter begins. I commend to you our sister Phoebe. The NRSV says a deacon of the church in Cenchrea, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many, and of myself as well. Now, this is the NRSV, which I use regularly, but if these translators were in my Greek class, they'd get a C-. By the way, I probably said this here before, and I'll say it again. Never kid yourselves, publishing Bibles is about making money. Okay? So here's what this actually says. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a diakonos. That's the Greek word. It is the Greek word from which we get our word deacon. But there was no office of deacon in the middle of the first century. That is the word. I was getting annoyed at the translation. I caught myself. So that is the word that the early believers adopted for their pastors and leaders in this infant Jesus movement, was diakonos. The word literally means servant. So that tells us a good bit about the early church in terms of their understanding of leadership. Leadership was about service. Okay? And so that's the language that they adopted for their pastors and leaders in the first century world. But you'll notice that this is not translated as pastor of the church. Paul has zero trouble using the same term for Phoebe that he uses for himself and his male ministry partners. It's the bias of the translators that shows up in the English translation that makes her a deacon or a deaconess. Those translators assumed that Phoebe couldn't, or perhaps shouldn't, have been a pastor leader in the early movement, so Paul could not have meant that. See why they get a C- in my class? But like I said, that's a problem of the translators. It's not a problem for Paul. Paul has no trouble calling her a diakonos. So what we learn in the very first line is that Phoebe was the pastor, leader of the ecclesia, remember I mentioned last week that Greek word that is translated as church, and we translate as church and just run on with it. But the word in that culture really was an assembly of free citizens who were choosing the course of their own lives. And that's the term the early believers adopted for their communities of faith. That's a significant term. This is who they envision themselves being. An assembly of free citizens choosing the course of their own lives, led by this woman in Cenchrea. So right off the bat, we get an interesting introduction to this woman, right? She is from Cenchrea, which was a sister city to Corinth, which was in Greece. This was a letter written to Rome. So that means that Phoebe was a visitor and traveler to the city of Rome in a world where travel was difficult, often dangerous, and very expensive. So what is Phoebe doing there? Why has she traveled to Rome? And here again, so interesting, scholars believe, I believe as well, that Phoebe took Paul's letter to the believers in Rome to Rome. There's no postal service, no FedEx, no UPS in the first century world, right? So if you write a letter, first of all, you don't wake up one day and go, I'm missing those folks. I think I'm going to send them a card. Because you can't get it there easily. So you have to have a darn good reason for composing a letter. Again, getting the writing materials. You don't go down to Walgreens and buy a legal pad and a big pen. You got to get the writing materials. You got to get the letter composed. And then if you get all that done, you got to get it there. Okay? So you see, this is you don't just wake up one day and go, I need to send Martin a card. You know, that's not happening. So this is an important letter, important enough for Paul to go to that trouble, and then to get it there, he sends it with Phoebe. So she takes it to Rome. That also means, if indeed that is correct, then that also likely means that when she gets there, she's going to be the one to read it aloud to the community of believers, because this was a world where most people could not read. Okay? And so she's going to have to read it aloud to the community, and that also means that she is going to be the one that if they go, wait a minute, what did he mean by that? And have you read Romans lately? There are going to be more than a few of those kinds of questions. So what did he mean by that? She's going to be the one to have to answer those questions on Paul's behalf. In fact, here's the other piece of this. She may have actually had a role in composing it, the letter. Paul dictated his letters. He spoke them out loud. And you got to figure that every now and then he would do this. He would go, Catherine, okay, I need to say this. If I say it like this, does that work? How many times y'all reckon somebody went, no, do not say it like that. Let's. They should have. There were a couple times when they were not in the room, and they should have been. So she may have been a part of that conversation, since she's going to be the one to take it, read it, and have to answer any questions that arise. Now that tells us the great likelihood that Phoebe was an educated woman in a world where women were rarely educated. So another little piece of her story. Okay, so with all of that, the next part of the description, Paul says, tells them to help her in whatever she may require from you, which likely means that she's there also to do advance work on a mission to Spain. Back in chapter 15 of the letter, Paul talks about he's coming to see them, and then he wants them to help him get to Spain. Because again, travel is not easy and it's not cheap. Phoebe is likely there to do the advance work, which tells us something about her organizing skills and her administrative skills as she's doing this. And then there's this interesting piece right at the end where Paul says that she had been a patron. The English translation says benefactor. I don't love that word. But a patron in that world was someone who had resources somebody else needed, and they come to an agreement by, I'll give you this if you do this. And the interesting thing about that piece of information about Phoebe, first of all, is that she has access to and control of resources in a world where women rarely did. So that's curious. She's controlling of something. How'd that come about? And Paul actually would not take money from other believers in and around Corinth. Remember, Cenchrea is a sister city for Corinth. And he won't take money from them, and it becomes a thing between him and those Corinthian believers. Because patronage in that world, because it's this quid pro quo thing, Paul was apparently unwilling to take money from Corinthian believers because he didn't want to do the quid pro quo. In other words, you can't say that. You can't preach that. Or you have to do this, or you can't do that. Richard Horsley, great New Testament scholar from whom I've learned a lot, says Paul would not be anybody's house apostle. So he wouldn't take their money. And like I said, it becomes a thing in the Corinthian letters between himself and Corinthian believers. But he takes money from Phoebe, which tells us again about her integrity, her generosity, her willingness to give this money and trust Paul to do what he needs to do according to God's call. And so it says something about their relationship as well. It tells us an awful lot about Phoebe. So we put all these pieces together. Look at the portrait we can paint of this woman in just these few words. I did mention this earlier. I can say it now. Her name is a Gentile name. So she's a Gentile woman who must have had, as I already said, come from a family of means and status because of her control of resources. She is an educated woman. She's an urban woman because of the Cenchrea connection. She exercised leadership, significant leadership in an early community of believers in Cenchrea at a time when, again, all of those things we just named, as I said, were very uncommon for women to do, and Paul trusted her. He trusted her enough to take money. He trusted her to take the letter to Rome and to read it to believers, to answer any questions. It tells us a lot about her, and she accomplished these things and became such a person in a world where the cultural narrative about women was that they were weak, passive, inadequate, and incapable of doing the things that Phoebe actually was doing. Don't you love that when somebody says, you can't do that? I'm doing it, right? And that was the situation. So how did this woman come to be this woman? And unfortunately, we don't know. That's all we know in these few words about Phoebe from this letter. But I like to imagine, and I love imagining, when you don't know, you got gaps in the story, what can we surmise? What's possible? I like to imagine that Phoebe first encountered the story of what was possible in this Jesus movement from another smart, strong woman mentioned in this chapter. Verse 3 in Romans 16 says, Greet Prisca and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, and to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Prisca and Aquila were actually incredibly important people in this early Jesus movement as it is unfolding and kind of growing into itself. And that may be especially true of Prisca. So here's a little piece of info. They are mentioned 6 times in the New Testament. 4 of those 6 times, her name is first. And again, in this world, to list a wife first was just more than uncommon. It was practically unheard of. Okay? 4 out of 6 times her name is mentioned first. Because we meet them in other places in the New Testament, we know a little bit more of their story than we do of Phoebe. So Acts 18, for example, tells us that they were Jewish folk, originally from Rome, but who had been expelled from Rome in an expulsion of Jews, not all Jews, and we don't really know. It could have been actually over Jesus. It could have been a conflict between Jewish believers in Jesus and Jews who weren't believers that got loud and disruptive, shall we say. But we don't know. It could have been that. But they were expelled in the expulsion, and they ended up settling in Corinth, which is where Paul meets them. They were working class people. They were tent makers. Now, they didn't make tents for people to, spend the weekend camping out in a national park. They may have made tents for Roman soldiers. And if that's the case, that's a bit more lucrative than most working class centers in the early Jesus movement. Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome. And they are there in all of those places. And notice that Paul says that he and all the Gentile churches give thanks to God for them. And don't forget, they are a Jewish couple that these Gentile churches are giving thanks for. We know a couple of other things about them. Acts tells us that they, not just Aquila, but they taught a character that we meet in Acts and who also shows up in the Corinthian letters, a guy named Apollos. Apollos was an Alexandrian Jew, Alexandria, Egypt, a wealthy, educated, and apparently very eloquent speaker. That's sort of how his story comes up in a couple of times. And so they meet him in Corinth, they meet him in Ephesus, and he has only heard a portion of the story of what was happening in the Jesus movement, and so they are the ones who fill him in, who say, here's what happened next. Because otherwise, somebody like Apollos doesn't listen to them. So that may mean they had greater education than most working people did in their day. And again, very interesting that Prisca's name is first, as are those who helped to teach him. I wish we knew more of that story. How did they become who they became? And Paul also reports, back to Romans 16, that they risked their necks for him. At some point, they saved his life. At the risk of their own. Wouldn't we love to know that story? We don't. Unfortunately, Phoebe. So Phoebe lived in Cenchrea, sister city to Corinth. She was a pastor there and a trusted co-worker of Paul. Prisca lived for a while in Corinth, was a pastor leader and a trusted co-worker of Paul. So didn't these two women have to have known each other? I think they absolutely had to have known each other. And so let's imagine that for a moment. A high-born and a working-class woman, one Jewish, one Gentile, neither one conforming to the stereotypes of women in their world, both of them smart, strong, accomplished, both of them faithful and devoted to the early Jesus movement as it is growing into itself. In a world where Roman order and culture would never have allowed these women to know each other, much less become friends. I wonder how many of you have had the experience of feeling terribly alone in some way, going through something in a work setting, whatever it may have been, and you feel like you're alone, and then you meet somebody who gets it, who gets you, and you find out you're not as alone anymore. I mean, how important are those experiences for us when they happen, right? Years ago, when I was a grad student myself, it's been more years ago now than I'd like to think, but prior to me becoming a grad student, and I was still new as a woman in this. In fact, my dissertation supervisor, I was the first woman he had ever supervised, which was both a blessing and a curse. And they talked about it saved them because they were beginning to think they were the crazy ones. Nobody thought like they did. They saw things differently. You know, all of that dynamic. And they talked about the importance of that for each of them, right? And so I had this sense of Phoebe and Prisca finding each other. And, oh, you too, you know, as they have that encounter. So think about them. Phoebe growing up in a male-dominated culture, which likely judged her harshly for not conforming to women's roles. Prisca, the same dynamic. I heard a podcast this week. I've become a walker. I started during the pandemic, taking long walks and listening to podcasts. Saved my life during the pandemic. I heard one this week that reminded me that human beings they were defective. They were defective men, lacking certain equipment. Right? Literally, that's how they did. And as a result of that, they were weak, inadequate, and only good for producing other human beings. One of my students at the seminary called them baby ovens, is how she described it in the first century world. That was the cultural narrative about the place and value of women in the first century world. What happens when a cultural narrative like that does not fit your own life and experience? Right? It is crazy making. You know, you wonder if you are the crazy women and what is possible for their lives because of this new story. And I love to think about this. I love to think about them and the conversations they would have had, laughing together at all the things they were told they could not or should not do as they were doing them. I bet they griped together, particularly about what was happening among the believers around Cenchrea and Corinth, because there was lots of things to gripe about if you read Paul's letters. Don't you know they talked about Paul? And finished those conversations with whatever the first century equivalent of God love him was, right? Surely they prayed together and worshiped together and shared bread at Christ's table together. And as they did all of these things, these two women actually embodied the proclamation that race, ethnicity, class, gender, none of that matters to God because we are all one in Christ Jesus. And they were living this out. We are all beloved children of God. We all belong. We all belong at Christ's table. Prisca and Aquila had to move, but I've had to move, and even when we knew it was the right thing, it is painful, you know, to have someone move away. And there was this time when Prisca and Aquila moved to Ephesus. I have to imagine that they wept together when that happened. And then Prisca and Aquila end up back in Rome. So here's the thing I wonder. When Paul needed somebody to take this letter to Rome, how quickly did Phoebe say, I'll do it? Because Prisca is there. And I can reconnect with someone who really, really mattered. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. Yes, you may be familiar with the term Priscilla and Aquila, which is how Luke refers to her in Acts. The reason I don't use Priscilla is because Paul, who actually knew her, doesn't. He calls her Prisca. And Priscilla is a diminutive of Prisca, like little Bobby for Robert. It annoys me that, that Luke does that. Yeah. So Paul always calls her Prisca, and so I do that as well. If indeed she went there, Phoebe went to Rome because Prisca was there, I hope Prisca introduced her to another woman believer in Rome, whom we meet in verse 7 of Romans 16, here's what we find. Greet Andronicus and Junia. See what I mean about the names? All right, all right. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives and fellow prisoners, who are noted among the apostles and who were in Christ before me. Once again, the English translations have hid from us the importance of this woman, Junia. Here's how they did it this time. Despite the evidence to the contrary, translators, until just recently, and some still haven't changed this practice, translators have made her name into Junias instead of Junia. Now, the importance of that is that ancient Greece is gender specific. So in our time, a name like Chris or even a name like Alex, could be a woman or a man, but you didn't do that. You don't do that in gender-specific languages. So Junia is a woman's name, and Junias would be a man's name. And so they insisted on translating it Junias, even though all the evidence in the text itself says it should be Junia, and there is no record anywhere that the male name Junias even existed in the first century world. Now, maybe it did because there's a lot of stuff that didn't survive. But based on what we have, it didn't even exist. And even so, even with the evidence, even with that piece, English translators insisted on translating it as Junias and making her name a man's name. You know why? Because Paul called these two people, Andronicus and Junia, apostles. And the bias of the translators was that a woman should not be an apostle. So this is this movement as we take a look at it. So Paul, let me start with this. Paul did not limit the term apostle to the 12. We are so funny. We talk about the 12 apostles, but then we talk about the apostle Paul. Have you added those up? That's not 12. Right? It's a baker's dozen, I suppose, if you want to do that. But that was the way Luke talked, and we've adopted it. Paul did not. For Paul, Paul says that God appointed apostles first in the church, always insisted that he was an apostle, and that other people around him, Barnabas, for example, Andronicus and Junia, were apostles. He didn't limit it to the 12. An apostle instead was the word literally means somebody sent with a message. And the message that they were sent with is Christ is risen. So that makes apostles hugely important among those early believers. Okay? The proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. And Andronicus and Junia, Paul counts among those apostles. In fact, he says they were prominent among the apostles. They were people of note among the apostles. Andronicus is likely Julia's husband, which means that these two have a lot in common with Prisca and Aquila. Married couples, likely all apostles, traveling and doing gospel work. And that gives me an opportunity to give some attention to the men in the story. For those of you who are starting to wonder if I wasn't going to do that. What we see here is a different model of marriage. We've already talked about gender roles coming undone. The narrative about marriage in the first century world was that the husband, was the head of the household. In a very hierarchical structure, I mentioned that last week. And the wife was children and servants. They owed the husband gratitude, loyalty, and obedience. And she was there not to be a partner in affairs. But among the early believers, that was not the case. And here are two married couples telling a different narrative about marriage, where both of them are working, where both of them and both of their vocations matter, where they are doing gospel work together. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul writes to Corinthian believers a really radical idea, which is that there should be mutuality in marriage. That husbands and wives decide things together. That each of them belongs to the other one. It wasn't news that the wife belonged to the husband. It was news that the husband also belonged to the wife. And it's a different model of marriage. And since Paul himself was not married, I have to wonder if he got these ideas from watching Prisca and Aquila and Andronicus and Junia and watching them operate very differently. So all indications were that these two men did not just say, we are all one in Christ Jesus. They actually practiced it. Working alongside Prisca, Junia, Paul, and all of the other saints who were working together in God's renewal in creation. They are telling a different story about gender, about marriage, and part of what this tells us also is that these were men who were open to God's newness. The cultural story is this: God has a different story. And let's be honest, human beings aren't real good with change. And we have a tendency to think that people who benefit from the way things are particularly not good with change, and that's true, but none of us are. I mean, people will stay in circumstances that don't benefit them because we find change so challenging. So give a shout out to these folks who are open to a different story and who live out for us a different way of being together, a different marriage, a different relationship between genders, a different relationship between class and ethnicity and all those things that we've talked about, right? So, Andronicus and Junia are a part of this news story. They are also, Paul says, they were his relatives, which probably means not like cousins, but probably simply means that they were Jewish, like as he was, the way people talked in that world. And at some point, they were in prison with Paul. Wouldn't you? That's another story. Wouldn't you love to know that story? So Prisca and Aquila risked their necks for Paul. Andronicus and Junia at one point were in prison with Paul. Would love to know that story. We don't, but the comment just by itself tells us about their commitment to Jesus, to this movement, their strength, their courage, their faithfulness, and that their gospel work must have been bold and impactful, because you don't arrest people who aren't making waves. And Paul says they were in Christ before he was. That's curious. Makes me wonder if they were originally from Palestine, maybe even from Jerusalem. If so, then like Prisca and Aquila, they were also travelers, those who traveled and took the word of what God was doing in the world to different places. It's hard to determine their class status. They could have been upper class like Phoebe. They could have been working class in some ways with particularly lucrative work like Prisca and Aquila. But what we know is significant. It's one of those, again, though, I wish I knew more. So, aren't these fascinating people? These little bits that we get here. So, let's put together what we learn about being saints from these saints. I used Willie Jennings' idea last week that said that saints were among those who belong to God. Belong in the sense not just of like being members of, but I used the illustration last week of my niece and some financial difficulties and my helping out and not ever going to expect her to repay that because my niece belongs to me. So that sense of what Willie Jennings called radical belonging. That's a marvelous way to think about saints. Today, we can add to our understanding. And let me start with a prominent idea that stands out to me from these stories. We've got a highborn woman, maybe Andronicus and Junia were also highborn, we don't know, but we know we have at least one highborn person. We have working class people. We have Jew and Gentile. We have male and female together in a world where all of these people would have been divided from one another quite intentionally by Roman culture and order. And yet here they are together. So here is a significant understanding of being a saint that we should take, and that is, saints bring people together. Saints are those who welcome and unite and love and share. So the good news is that being a saint is not about spiritual or moral perfection. So everybody can take a deep breath, right? It's not about spiritual or moral perfection. And by the way, any reading of Paul's letters will show he's not. Again, God love him. And at times, absolutely brilliant, profound beyond belief. And then petty and short-sighted. Come on, Paul, really? At times? But I love that about him. I love that it makes him relatable. Okay? So, saints are not those about moral or spiritual perfection, but they are those who bring people together. They not only believe in, but they also practice the idea that all of us belong to God, and then we belong to each other because we belong to God. And if love is the defining characteristic of God's kingdom, do you see it has to be that way? I sometimes say, look, if you really don't want to love your enemies, you are going to be so unhappy in God's eternity, because that's what we're going to be doing. And saints launch this loving and bringing people together. And we can add, saints also are open to the newness of God's renewal. A new story, a new model for how we relate to one another to change. And look, I already said, human beings aren't good at change. We are so prone to fall back on, well, the world is thus. You can't fight City Hall. Some things never change. The world is just this way, and that's the way it's supposed to be. We are so good at falling back on those things. Just the way it is. Okay, God is so unimpressed with those ways of thinking. God is at work renewing all of creation. Renewing all of creation. And sometimes that renewal requires us to have a change in perspective, a change in practice, to hear and to share a new story from the one that maybe has been handed to us. It calls us to embrace the possibility that newness is possible. And you know what? It might be if we try it, we actually like it better than what we got. Right? Have you ever had that happen where you resisted, and you finally gave in, and it was like, what was my problem here? Right? So, in the Roman world, Phoebe and Prisca could never have been friends. Andronicus and Aquila would never have allowed their wives to do the things that they did. Paul would not have referred to the women in this particular chapter as ministers and apostles capable of the things that they actually did. That was the Roman world. And God had a different story. God had a renewing story. God has ideas that are possible and calls them to belong to God and to one another, and therefore to live into those possibilities. And the saints are those who said, let's do this. And when you go into worship today, thank God for all of them, right, who've gone before us. So, yeah.
Thanks be to God for Mitzi. Thank you so much. Thank you. One of the saints, for sure. We have a few minutes for questions, and this is not necessarily a question to start with, but a comment. So appreciating, we're so good at honoring so many different kinds of relationships, marriage, parenting, sibling, all of those things, but to sit for a moment and relish a good description of what friends mean.
Yeah, right.
So thank you for that as a model of another relationship that I think sometimes gets put on a different shelf.
I agree. Yeah.
and to raise that up and the importance of that among the many kinds of relationships that we're involved in. So thank you for that, for highlighting
I agree.
friendship.
I agree. So grateful for the friends in my own life, and I hope you are as well. And don't take them for granted, because they move away and then I'm mad.
I really enjoyed your talk. It seems to be contradictory that in parts of some of Paul's letters he said like women should be silent and things. How do you?
Yeah, so unfortunately there's not a simple answer to that. I know you're shocked, right? So let me start with, and I hope this is not unsettling for those of you who may not know, but all of the letters that have the wives be submissive to their husbands texts, so Colossians, Ephesians, what's Ephesians and the Pauline thing? I don't think it's in First Timothy has other problematic, like women should learn in silence. There's every likelihood that Paul did not write those. That's right. That people who wanted to claim Paul's authority would have written those. Let me say really quickly that in the first century world, that would not have been deceitful or lying as we would consider it. They would have said, I am shouldering Paul's authority and passing this on, and they simply, in my view, got it wrong. So let me start with that, and again, I hope that's not unsettling for some folks. But on the other hand, Paul himself messes up in a couple of places. The women be silent in the churches in 1 Corinthians 14 is really problematic. Because Paul definitely wrote 1 Corinthians. It is possible he didn't write that. But we don't know. If he did, he may have been quoting some Corinthians, because the line that follows that is, what, did the word of God originate with you? And so he may have been actually quoting what some Corinthians were saying sarcastically and then firing back at them. That one's tough. And the veils text in 1 Corinthians 11, he's just wrong. And Prisca and Phoebe were not in the room when he was dictating that, because if they had been, they would have laid into him over that one, I think. But again, for me, and the reason I say, the thing about the veils, if you don't know that text, he says the women have stopped wearing the veils, which is probably a little bit like Jewish people having to wear a yellow star in the Third Reich. And it identified them as less than in Roman culture. And they said they weren't doing it anymore. And everything that we've got from Paul, I would have expected him to say, you shouldn't do it. Good for you. And he doesn't. He says, put the freaking veils back on. I think he had a bad day. And when Phoebe and Prisca found out he'd put that in that letter, he heard about it. I said a moment ago that, aren't we all contradictory at times? And we say this, but we do this. And all of us, are you culturally impacted in ways you don't even recognize? If you don't know that about yourself, you are. I am one, for example, that absolutely affirms, given climate crisis, given issues of justice in terms of wealth and stuff, I am an affirmer of simplicity. I even have on my wall in my study a lovely piece of art that says simplify. I believe that. I affirm that. I look around my house and say, where did all this stuff come from? And I realize I'm more enculturated than I had realized. And Paul was more enculturated than he realized. So the answer to that question is messy, in other words. Yeah, so it's a good question. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm coming. Kate,
Get your steps in, Catherine.
yeah.
This may sound like a silly question, but I kept wondering the age of these women.
And there's no way to know. It appears, from what we know, that they are not functioning as mothers at the moment. Maybe they never did, or maybe their children are all adults, which would tell us something about their age. Phoebe may have been widowed, because a husband is never mentioned. if that's true, again, that would suggest, again, later in life than earlier in life. But boy, that's about it, that we've got. Wish we knew more. I always, yes, such incredible bravery. I always tell my students, one day we're going to find another cache of Dead Sea Scrolls, and when we do, there are going to be a whole bunch of stories we've been waiting all of our lives to hear. I hope that's true. Yeah.
Hi. I just, in my own reading, I noticed that when Paul first refers to Aquila and Prisca, it's Aquila and Prisca, and all of a sudden it flips later on, and she becomes,
Right.
And I was just wondering, was she the more, I don't know, the more dominant one, and he the more supportive one, or do you have
That's
any
entirely
insight into
possible.
that?
Yeah, that's entirely possible. It is striking that 4 of the 6 times their names are there, hers is first, which does suggest either because of what she overcame in terms of gender roles to become who she was, or because maybe she's the outgoing personality. Maybe she is the speaker among the couple. Maybe he is, again, the one who is doing the more behind-the-scenes kinds of things. It's hard to know, but it is suggestive that her name is first 4 of the 6 times. I think it doesn't necessarily say anything negative about Aquila, but it probably does tell us something about her and what a significant human being, she was. So, again, therefore the lack of story just, hurts there. Yeah, go ahead.
This is the historian in me. The Episcopal Church had deaconesses until about 1970, when that role was abolished. All women and men in that order are deacons.
Yes. Yeah, thanks be to God.
Which was the first step toward, it was a necessary step on the process to getting women as priests. You had to get everybody into one order, because you had to be a deacon before you could be a priest. And because they were separate orders, they needed to merge those on their way to the ordination of women in priesthood.
And when you make a distinction, when you do a deacon and a deaconess, you are doing a gender,
Right, because the roles actually were different, and I'm not a priestess. Other question? Yeah.
I'm just curious, when the research, particularly about Junius came to light, because these are stories I know I never heard
Yes.
growing up.
Let me see if I want to say the first piece on this, I've read the piece. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who was a pioneering feminist New Testament scholar whom I got to meet once. And you know how sometimes you meet your heroes and you wish you hadn't? That was not the case here. I spent an hour in a conversation with her. It's like still ranks as one of the best hours I've spent in my life. Not only a marvelous scholar, but a marvelous human being. And she did the initial work on the women in Romans 16, including Junia. And I want to say it was in the 80s. But it takes that long for something in academia to begin to filter down. And part of my conversation with her, she's a German intellectual, and her writing is not easily understood. It's real. I have to have a dictionary sometimes reading, what she does, and this is my field. I know the language. And she said, unapologetically, I showed them all that this is intellectually rigorous. It is your job to take it to the church. And that was the part of the conversation. But it takes it a while. So I'm pretty sure that article, it could have been 90s. I think it was 80s that article was published. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So our time comes to an end, and you mentioned that your friends have moved away. How glad we are that you have not. Mitzi is a gift to the city. She's just like, she's a chaplain to clergy and We love when she comes to visit, and we're not the only congregation that is hungry for her wisdom, so we're glad that she spends the time with us that she does. So thanks, y'all. We'll see you in church.
Yeah, thanks.